So hi, I'm Steve Light, and this is one of my story boxes, and I have everything that I need inside this box to tell you a story. Well, this story is Hansel and Gretel, so I'm gonna start telling this story. Story starts with a little boy named Hansel and a little girl named Gretel. Now they lived in a cottage in the forest where there were lots of trees, and they lived with their father in this cottage of trees all over. Now their father was a woodcutter, and every day he would go to the forest and chop down some trees to make firewood, and he would bring them to town to sell to people to make fires, because they didn't have heaters and thermostats like we do today. They needed to build a fire to stay warm. Well, one day he had chopped lots of firewood, and he said to Hansel and Gretel, he said, "Now, Hansel, Gretel, I'm going to town to sell my firewood. Stay in the cottage. Do not go into the forest, or you may get lost and never find your way back." And they said, "Okay, father," and he left. And Hansel and Gretel, they were having lots of fun in the cottage. They played some games, they drew some pictures, but then Hansel was kind of getting bored, and he said, "Oh, I know, let's go into the forest. That'll be so much fun." And Gretel said, "Don't you remember? Father said not to go into the forest, or we might get lost and never find our way back." And Hansel said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Oh, I know. Let's leave some breadcrumbs, and then we can follow the breadcrumbs back to the cottage." So that's what they did. They got some breadcrumbs, and they started to leave the breadcrumbs through the forest as they walked. And they saw a little chipmunk run across their path, and they saw a deer, so they had to be really quiet not to scare the deer. And then what they also saw were lots and lots of little birds. What they didn't know is that the birds were eating all of the breadcrumbs. And the birds had eaten all the breadcrumbs. Well, Hansel and Gretel were starting to get tired, and they said, "Let's follow our breadcrumbs back to the cottage now." And they turned around, and when they turned around, they scared away all the birds. And the birds all went away, and there were no breadcrumbs, and there were no birds. "Oh no, which way is the cottage? How are we gonna find our way back? Oh, maybe it's this way," and they ran this way, but it wasn't that way. And they said, "Oh, maybe it's this way," and they ran that way, but it wasn't that way. And they said, "Oh, maybe it's this way, but it wasn't that way." And they said, "Oh no, we're never gonna find our way back. We should have listened to Father." Hansel, do you smell that? Oh, Gretel, I smell cookies, and I smell candy, and I smell cakes. And they followed their noses to a candy cottage that was covered with candies and cookies and cakes and all kinds of things. And they were so hungry because they had been out in the forest for such a long time that they ran to the cottage and they started to eat pieces of the cottage. Hansel broke off a part of the windowsill and he started to eat it. "Oh, Gretel, it tastes like chocolate chip cookies." And Gretel, she took off part of the front door and she started eating it. He said, "Oh, this tastes like chocolate cake." And they were eating and eating because they were so hungry. When all of a sudden, who came out of the cottage but the Crunch Witch? And the Crunch Witch came and she said, "Oh, little mice must be eating my house. Oh no, it is little children. Oh my goodness, you must be lost. Come, you must be so hungry." And she took them inside the house and she gave them cookies and candies and cakes and all kinds of things to eat. And she said, "Oh, you must be so tired. Come, lay down, go to sleep, and in the morning I will make you big breakfast." And so she put them in another room, and she went into the kitchen, and Hansel and Gretel went to sleep. Well, Hansel hadn't eaten anything all day, and all he had eaten was cookies and candies and cakes, and so his stomach started to grumble, and he woke up, and he went into the kitchen, and he saw the Crunch Witch was there, and she was reading her book on how to cook little children. And she said, "Oh, I am going to make Hansel pie and Gretel flambe, and I am going to cook those children and eat them tomorrow." And Hansel said, "Oh my goodness." And he went back without the Crunch Witch hearing him, and he said, Gretel, wake up. The Crunch Witch, she's going to eat us tomorrow." And Gretel said, "Don't be ridiculous. This is a nice old woman. She gave us food and a place to eat, to sleep, and everything. I can't believe that." And he said, No, go see." So she went and she peeked around and she saw the Crunch Witch reading her recipe book on how to cook little children. And she said, "Oh, Hansel, go back to sleep. Don't worry. Tomorrow we will teach that Crunch Witch a lesson." Well, the next morning they woke up and there was a big pot in the middle of the kitchen with a lid that fit on it. and it was right there. And they came in, and the Crunch Witch said, "Oh, I have a big breakfast for you." And she gave them waffles and pancakes and muffins and all kinds of things to eat. And they ate and they ate, and then she said, "Oh, now children, look, I have this big pot. I want you to climb into the pot way down in the bottom. You will see something in there. I want you to just climb in there and get it for me." And Gretel knew that it was a trick. And Gretel said, "But we are much too small to climb in such a big pot." She said, "Oh, no, what do you mean? It is very easy. You just go like this. You just put one leg over like this and you climb in." And Gretel, thinking very quickly, she took the lid to the pot and she trapped the witch in there and she said, "Let me out, let me out, let me out." And Hansel and Gretel, they ran out of the cottage, but they were still lost. They didn't know their way. And they said, "Oh my goodness," and by this time, "Let me out, let me out, let me out." The Crunch Witch had gotten out and she started to chase after them. Well, they ran and they ran and they ran until they got to a big, rushing river. And the river was rushing and the waves were rolling. And Hansel and Gretel ran right up to it and they were much too small to swim across such a big, rough river. And the Crunch Witch was after them, "Come back here, come back here." When all of a sudden, the biggest duck they had ever seen came swimming along the river. And they said, "Oh, Mr. Duck, will you please help us get across the river? The Crunch Witch is chasing after us." And he said, "Quack, quack, sure, hop on." So they hopped on the back of the biggest duck they had ever seen, and he swam out into the middle of the river. Well, all of a sudden, here came the Crunch Witch. "Come back here, I want to eat up those children." And she jumped into the water before she remembered that she didn't know how to swim. And bloop, 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 she sunk down to the bottom of the river, and they never saw the Crunch Witch ever again. Well, the duck continued to the other side of the river, and Hansel and Gretel got out. And they said, "Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Duck." And he said, "Quack, quack, don't mention it." And he swam away. But Hansel and Gretel, they were still lost. And they said, "Oh no, we still don't know our way home. What are we gonna do?" And then all of a sudden, they saw a tree. They said, "Hey, isn't that the tree that we always climb on?" And they said, "Yes. Oh, our cottage must be very close by." And they ran to their cottage, and there was their father. And their father came out, and he said, "Oh, my children are home and safe. I have looked everywhere for you. Oh." And he gave them each a kiss. Mwah, mwah. And he said, "Promise me you will never go into the forest alone ever again." And they promised, and they never saw the Crunch Witch ever again. And they never went into the forest alone ever again. And they lived happily ever after. The end. Is that a good one? Yeah? Oh, good. I'm glad you guys like that.